So what's up, everyone? I had a root canal done today, so I had to miss a little bit of work. I can't feel half of my face, but that freed up part of my day for me to actually have time to film a YouTube video for you all. I've actually been sitting on this case study here for a week or two now, and it was sent to me from one of my friends. His name's James. He's a Toyota tech down in Texas. Now, James pretty much had this car diagnosed. He just wanted me to look at some waveforms, I believe just to see if he was on the same path that I thought he should be on. But regardless, we're going to take you through his diagnostic process and how he got to viewing these waveforms and what I seen when he actually sent me these waveforms to view. So what were the symptoms? He had a slight misfire on cylinder 3 at idle. It only had 3 or 4 counts of misfire, 3 or 4 misfire counts, and then it would reset. So very slight misfire at idle, but under light to medium loads, the misfire would be pretty extreme and the check engine light would start flashing. So what did James check? Well, James, or maybe it was his co-worker, I'm pretty sure he was helping his co-worker. They swapped the ignition coil and spark plug from cylinder 3 into another known good cylinder. Retested, misfire did not move, still on cylinder 3. So they swapped the fuel injector. Again, after swapping the fuel injector, misfire did not move. They performed a compression test and a leak down test. Now, think about this. You now have checked ignition coils, spark plugs, fuel injectors. I'm fairly certain just by knowing James that he also checked ignition coil command, fuel injector control, checked compression. Compression was even on all cylinders. I didn't get a spec from him, but again, knowing James, I know that this compression was good. And they performed a leak down test, and this had no leak, which is actually surprising for both of us, because even I have a couple videos of these Corolla engines, head gaskets failing on them. So, performed a leak down test. He had no leak down, including no compression loss into the cooling system from a failed head gasket. What do you do? Electrically, you're good. Mechanically, you seem to be good, at least based on some old school testing methods that are perfectly acceptable, but they miss some things. So what do you do next? Well, James took it upon himself, and he did all of this before reaching out to me. James took it upon himself to do an in-cylinder waveform. So if you don't know what an in-cylinder waveform is, you're taking a pressure transducer. That pressure transducer gets screwed into a spark plug hole, and it converts pressure to voltage so that you can then look at your pressure inside of your cylinder on an oscilloscope, and it will be graphed through means of voltage. Now your oscilloscope then turns that voltage back into a pressure reading, but that's not too important. What we're doing is we are going to graph the pressure changes within the cylinder, and James did it at idle, and that's when he sent me these waveforms. Now, before we look at James's waveform, we're going to just talk about the basics here of in-cylinder waveforms if you've never seen them before. This here is 720 degrees of crank rotation. Now remember, we have a pressure transducer in the spark plug hole. Combustion's not taking place here. So when I say expansion stroke, it can be the power stroke. It's neither here nor there. But ultimately, because no combustion's taking place, we're just going to call it the expansion stroke. 720 degrees of crank rotation you see from this line here and this line here. And where do I get those lines? Well, the very peak of these high ramps, that is top dead center of your compression stroke. What happens after compression? You have your power stroke or expansion stroke, followed by your exhaust stroke, your intake stroke, and again, your compression stroke. Now, some of the things to keep in mind here is how to view valve events. And that's going to be important here. During your expansion stroke, your piston is coming down. So how at this point here does pressure start to increase? Well, the answer to that is your exhaust valve is opening. All right. Now, to understand why you have intake or vacuum during this phase, we're going to skip a little farther down. We're going to skip to our intake stroke, and we're going to explain this process starting at your intake stroke. So during your intake stroke, intake valve is open, piston's descending, right? Now during your compression stroke, eventually, going to get back to this, but eventually your intake valve closes, you start compressing that air. No combustion takes place, right? So if we just go back to over here, this here's the top dead center of our compression stroke. Our piston starts to descend back into a vacuum state because no explosion took place. We had vacuum during our intake stroke, right? We close our intake valve. We should have a sealed cylinder when we compress it. When that piston comes back down, we should still have vacuum in that cylinder. But at this point here, why does pressure rise? Well, pressure rises because our exhaust valve opens and our exhaust stream has a higher pressure than what's inside of our combustion chamber. So you can look at this line, this change of pressure, to know where your exhaust valve opens, which is one of the key pieces of information you're going to get from an in-cylinder waveform. And on a Toyota engine, that typically happens between 40 to 50 degrees before your exhaust stroke. Just to keep that in mind. Now these are just rules of thumbs. It's going to be very important to get known good waveforms, especially on newer engines. But typically you're going to see about 40 to 50 degrees before your exhaust stroke, your exhaust valve opens. Now these long lines are 180 degrees apart. These short lines are 30 degrees apart. So you can see that our exhaust valve or our pressure change happens right between 30 and 60 degrees, which is, like I said, pretty typical of a lot of engines. Get known good so. What are we going to go to next? Right? So we want to see when our intake valve closes, and this is going to be pretty important. You see our intake stroke. Pretty flat line, right? Relatively speaking, it's a flat line. But when our piston is going up during the compression stroke, you see here that we have about 60 degrees before we start building pressure. Why is that? Because our intake valve is still open during the compression stroke. When you see the pressure start to increase, that is when the intake valve closes. Our intake valve closes right around 60 degrees after bottom dead center of our intake stroke, right? So our piston is now going back up, compressing. Intake valve is open. Here's 30 degrees. Here is 60 degrees. And you can see right at this point, you see a sharp change, pressure start to increase. Seeing these sharp changes is important. That's when you know the valves are slamming shut or slamming open. You don't want it to be sloped. But like I said, it's always good to get a known good waveform. And James is lucky. He only had cylinder 3 misfiring, so he grabbed cylinder 2 to compare to. All right. This here is James. This is James's known good waveform, and I just got done saying that about 40 to 50 degrees, somewhere in between there, is where most Toyota exhaust valve opens. And when I first seen this when I first seen his bad waveform, I seen his bad waveform before seeing this waveform. The first thing I thought, and the first thing I said to him is like, man, looks like your exhaust valve is opening late. And I measured it for him, right? You can see about right here, roughly, is when your exhaust valve is opening. And that's happening about 153, I have it measured, 153 degrees, which is what, 27 degrees before the exhaust stroke. This waveform looks a little bit different than the previous one. Previously, I was using Pico 6, this is now Pico 7. So these shades of blue are now every 180 degrees. So if this here is 180 degrees, this is happening about 27 degrees before our exhaust stroke. Now, Another thing I notice is we still have a pretty sharp line here for our intake valve closing. And that's happening right around 605 degrees, give or take a few degrees. That's right where Toyota always closes the intake valve, at least on 95% of their engines, right? But it was good to get a known good waveform to know that our exhaust valve closes a little late at idle on these engines. So if you ever have trouble seeing the changes, it's always good to just zoom into the very bottom of the waveform. Pico does such a good job zooming in and out of waveforms, and you can see the changes so much more easily when you zoom into them. So again, I zoomed in just to the very bottom of this waveform. I'm looking at the pressure changes, getting a pretty accurate measurement. And when I do that, you can see a pretty sharp change here where the exhaust valve opens, and you can see a pretty sharp change here where the intake valve closes. Full transparency, right? I suck at being able to look at where the exhaust valve closes and where the intake valve opens. It happens right around here. I struggle with that. Something I need to work on, but I've gotten by. I've gotten lucky. I've gotten by at just looking at exhaust valve opening and intake valve closing to see, relatively speaking, if my valve timing is accurate. Now, we're going to get sidetracked here. In the very next waveform I'm going to show is from a Silverado. The reason I'm going to show the Silverado is because it has an intake valve that is not opening. All right. Now keep this in mind right here. This here is a Corolla. It has 4 valves per cylinder, 2 intake valves, 2 exhaust valves, and you see a sharp change in pressure when that intake valve closes. It's not a nice rounded slope. It is a sharp change. This is a Silverado, 2 valves. Pretty sure it has 2 valves. 1 intake valve, 1 exhaust valve. The intake valve on this Silverado was not opening. Had bad lifters. Surprise, surprise, right? But you can see there is no sharp change in this waveform. It is very rounded. All right? I wanted you to see this because we are now going to look at an intake issue on a vehicle that has 2 intake valves. All right? And we're going to compare this intake valve closing to what James has sent me. Now, this is what James has sent me. All right? Now, I have this measured, intake valve closing at about 150 degrees. Is that right? That's not right. I had a hard time measuring when his intake valve closed because of how rounded it is. That's not an accurate measurement at all. I know that it's not accurate, but I had a hard time telling where the intake valve closed. And after James sent his known good waveform, and I realized that his exhaust valve was opening at the correct time, I then went to the intake valve, and I had a heck of a time measuring this. Now, it appears that we have a rounded pocket just like that Silverado, but like I said, we have 2 valves on this cylinder, so just keep that in mind, 2 intake valves. So what did I do? I zoomed in, trying to get a more accurate measurement, and I was still having trouble, so I drew a line at the very bottom. See this horizontal line? I drew a line at the bottom, and you can see roughly where pressure starts to build, and pressure starts to build at 150 degrees. Very, very shortly after the piston starts to go upwards in the combustion chamber. Now, why? Why is pressure building when we know that the intake valve should be open, but it's not as rounded as the Silverado, right? And I have a theory on this, and this is what I tried to explain to James, that hopefully led him to fixing this vehicle. Now, before I spill the beans on what I think, I put his known good waveform, and I put it on top of his cylinder 3, his misfiring cylinder, right? So green, keep this in mind, because on I think the next slide, or one of the next slides, I switched the colors. Like a dummy, I switched the colors. So green is his known good waveform. Red is his bad. Now you can see at this point, right here, there's a sharp change in pressure. That is where compression, that's when our intake valve closes, compression starts to build. But you can see on this bottom one, it is rounded, right? But keep in mind, we had compression and we had no leak down. How did we have compression if I'm thinking that the intake valve is not opening, right? Or closing, for that matter. Because like I said, I compared this to the Silverado. Silverado has one intake valve. Corolla has 2 intake valves. What is taking place here? So I zoomed in a little farther, right? Zoomed in, just like I always do. Again, you can see this sharp change right here. But you can see this slope that is taking place on his cylinder 3. On cylinder 3, it has a misfire. What am I thinking, right? It's time to spill the beans. This is at idle. I tried to get James to get a snap throttle or a like a brake torque waveform, but he'd already jumped into this after I told him what I thought was going on. So we did not get the waveform that I wanted. What I thought, in what we discussed, was this is sloped, right? Or what I thought was, this was rounded. Why was it rounded? Well, piston is going up, starting on the compression stroke, but only one of the valves was opening. Because the piston was going up, it had a slightly rounded pocket because there was a restriction. If both valves were open, you don't have much of a restriction. But because there was only one valve open, there was a restriction taking place. And we were not able to as easily push the air back out of the cylinder. When we weren't able to push that air back out of the cylinder, pressure started to increase very slowly, albeit very slowly, because we were able to get half of it out, but we weren't able to get it all out as quickly as we normally would. So as soon as that piston starts to increase, pressure starts to increase in that cylinder because both valves weren't open. That is what I thought was taking place. Now, so James took this valve cover off, and what did he find? He found this rocker sitting here, and it had come off of the cylinder 3 intake valve. So we were right in our assumptions, but just to clarify things, now that you know the answer, I'm going to go back and look at these one more time, right? So this was our known good. Green is our known good. You see that sharp change, right? Because our intake valves are open, both, and then both close, pressure starts to increase. Sharp change right at this point. Cylinder 3 is rounded. Why is it rounded? Well, our piston is going upwards, but only one of the intake valves are open, right? Because the intake valves don't close until 60 degrees into our compression stroke, right? But only one of them is open. And then as it closes, we start to build pressure. But even though just one was open, it had just enough restriction where it rounded our intake pocket. And that is what I had seen. That is what I had seen. That is what James has seen also. Or James seen when he sent me these emails. And what I wanted to share with you all is, but I wanted to share this with you all because I had seen a comment on a Facebook group, a Toyota Facebook group, from a guy who said there's no way to diagnose this issue without teardown. And I disagreed. You know, there's usually a way. Not always, but there's usually a way to test these things. But it's hard, right? These are very small differences between the two waveforms. And if you don't look at these regularly, it's something you can easily miss. And even myself, I work on Toyotas most of the time. I don't see tons of engine failures. I don't practice this stuff nearly enough, but luckily I surround myself with some of the smartest people in the industry, and they've taught me these techniques. People like Brandon Steckler and people like Mario at Super Mario Diagnostics. You know, those guys excel at this type of testing, and I'm grateful that I've been able to learn from them, and I'm even more grateful that I get to share it with you all and share it with people and help other technicians diagnose cars without tearing down engines and just guessing at the failure, and kind of having a plan of attack when you do have to tear it down, right? So James had an idea that the intake valve rocker fell off. He knew what to look for when he took that valve cover off, and it just so happens that we were right, and I wanted to share it with you all. So I hope you all enjoy that, and I hope I explained this well. I felt like I rambled a little bit, but I'm open to answer any questions in the comment section if you guys have any comments. Otherwise, make sure you all subscribe, and I will catch you all later.